For 30 years, the guests at one of the most exclusive resorts in America saw exactly what they came to see. They played golf on manicured lawns in the Allegheny Mountains. They took the mineral waters at the spa that had drawn visitors since before the country was founded. They held corporate conventions in a bright, modern exhibition hall in a part of the hotel called the West Virginia Wing. 26 presidents stayed at the Greenbrier over the years. European royalty stayed there. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor took the presidential suite. And to every single one of them, from the heads of state to the weekend golfers, the place was exactly what it appeared to be. A luxury hotel. Underneath that exhibition hall, behind an ordinary-looking section of wall, was a door. It weighed 25 tons and was roughly 5 feet thick, a blast door built to seal against a nuclear shockwave. And behind that door was a fortified concrete shelter built to hold every member of the United States Congress through the end of the world. It had dormitories with more than 1,100 bunks, a cafeteria that could seat 400, a 12-bed hospital with an operating room and an intensive care unit, separate chambers for the House of Representatives and the Senate. And on the lowest level, beneath the power plant, a pathological waste incinerator built to a specification that could cremate human bodies. For 3 decades, nobody outside a tight circle knew it was there. Guests held sales conferences directly on top of it. They danced above it. And then on the 31st of May, 1992, a reporter for the Washington Post published the secret, and the entire facility was effectively dead within a day. It all sat beneath the West Virginia Wing. The strangest part of this story is not that the government built the thing. It is how they hid it, in plain sight, using a construction project so enormous and so public that 50,000 tons of concrete could be poured next to a working luxury hotel without anyone asking the obvious question. The answer was a lie engineered directly into the architecture, and we will come back to exactly how it worked. To understand why any of this exists, you have to start with a real problem, and it is a more serious one than it first sounds. In 1955, President Eisenhower directed federal planners to think seriously about continuity of government. The scenario was straightforward and grim. If Washington were destroyed in a nuclear attack, the machinery of constitutional government had to survive somewhere, or the United States would face the thing the founders feared most, a collapse of legal authority and its replacement by military rule. A functioning Congress is not a luxury in that scenario. It is the difference between a country still governed by its own laws and a country governed by whoever holds the guns. So the planners were forced to ask a question that has no comfortable answer. If the Capitol is gone, where does Congress go? The answer they landed on was the Greenbrier, and the choice was not random. The resort already had a relationship with the federal government. During the Second World War, it had been used to in turn act as diplomats, and later as an army hospital. It sat about 250 miles from Washington, close enough to reach but far enough to lie outside the likely blast radius of a strike on the Capitol, tucked into the mountains of White Sulphur Springs. And, most conveniently of all, the resort was already planning a genuine expansion. That expansion became the perfect cover. In 1957, the Greenbrier announced a new wing. It would have guest rooms, an indoor recreation area, and a large exhibition hall for trade shows. In 1959, excavation began on what the locals started calling the Big Hole. It was, by every account, the biggest hole anyone in that small town had ever seen, and soon crews were pouring an astonishing quantity of concrete into it, around 50,000 tons. enough for underground walls several feet thick. The public was told this was the foundation work for the new exhibition hall. What was actually being buried beside the hotel was a government relocation facility, with the hotel wing built up on top of it and wrapped around it. The whole thing cost about $14 million, which is approximately $123 million in today's money. It had a code name. At first, it was called Project Casper. Later, it became Project Greek Island. It was operational by 1961. And here is the thing that makes this more than a simple secret. It was never really a rumor that stayed a rumor. The truth was, in a sense, overdetermined. Local construction workers had seen the scale of that concrete pour and knew no exhibition hall needed walls like that. Hotel staff across generations noticed details that did not add up. There was even one specific tell that a sufficiently sharp observer could have caught. The company that serviced the resort's televisions, a firm called Forsyth Associates, staffed its work with contractors rather than regular employees, and those contractors spent most of their time on something other than televisions. The information was out there in fragments for anyone who wanted to assemble it. It stayed hidden less because the secrecy was perfect, and more because nobody wanted to look at a five-star hotel and see a tomb. Which brings us back to the real question. How do you actually hide a structure of this size? The people who designed the Greenbrier facility did something clever, and it is the key to the whole story. Other Cold War bunkers relied on geography. They were dug deep into mountains, protected by hundreds of feet of solid rock. The Greenbrier did not do that. It relied on something cheaper and, for 30 years, far more effective. It relied on the West Virginia wing, and on a set of architectural deceptions a guest could reach out and touch and still never notice. Start with the scale of what was down there. The bunker ran to about 112,000 square feet across two main underground levels, 153 rooms in total. The walls were steel-reinforced concrete, in places 2 to 5 feet thick, and the whole structure was buried under roughly 20 feet of earth and rock, dug into the hillside. 18 dormitories were built to sleep more than 1,100 people in metal bunks. There was that 400-seat cafeteria, 3 water tanks holding 25,000 gallons each, a diesel power plant, and a full medical clinic with 12 beds, an operating room, an intensive care unit, a pharmacy, and even a dental suite. Now the deception itself, piece by piece, because each part is a small marvel of design. The blast doors first. There were 4 entrances, each sealed by a blast door, the largest weighing about 25 tons and standing 5 feet thick. And yet they were engineered so precisely, so perfectly balanced on their hinges, that a single person could swing one of them shut with roughly 50 pounds of pressure. The main pedestrian door, the one Congress would have walked through, was concealed behind what looked like an ordinary wall inside the exhibition hall. Then the exhibition hall itself, which is the heart of the trick. It was not a fake room. It was a real, working convention space, and the resort genuinely rented it out for trade shows. It even advertised an unusually high, reportedly almost unlimited, floor weight capacity for heavy displays. Think about what that means. Corporations were setting up their heaviest exhibits directly on the roof of a nuclear bunker, and the strange load rating that should have been a dead giveaway was instead marketed to them as a selling point. The hall's large concrete support columns, which no normal exhibition space would ever require, were structural reinforcement for the shelter built around it. And The working spaces followed the same logic. Arriving members of Congress would have first passed through decontamination showers, stripping off their clothes and changing into plain bunker uniforms. Then they would have gone to meet in the House and Senate chambers, rooms that on any ordinary day were simply more of the hotel's meeting and exhibition space. This is the point where the West Virginia wing stops being the name of a hotel wing and becomes the load-bearing lie of the entire operation. Because the wing was not a building standing next to the bunker. The wing and the bunker were poured as one continuous structure. The exhibition hall was the bunker's ceiling. Those convention columns were its ribs. The 88 guest rooms were its camouflage. A guest attending a sales conference in that hall was standing inside the shelter the whole time, on the wrong side of a blast door they never knew was there. And then there are the two details that make this place impossible to forget, and both of them are fully documented. The first is the television studio. Deep inside the bunker was a broadcast facility, and it came with a photographic backdrop of the United States Capitol. Some accounts describe changeable seasonal backdrops as well. The purpose was simple and chilling. A member of Congress broadcasting to a devastated and frightened nation from a shelter under a West Virginia golf course would appear on screen to be speaking calmly from Washington. The reassurance was built right into the wallpaper. The second is that incinerator. On the lowest level of the whole complex, the only part that descended to a third level down, beneath the power plant, sat a pathological waste incinerator. Officially, it was for medical waste, but it was built to handle human remains, which means the planners had thought this scenario all the way through to its logical end and quietly built the last room anyone down there would ever need. The point of all this is not that it was sinister. It is that it was thorough, and the thoroughness is the tell. Every single element, the fake windows painted with peaceful country scenes in the dining hall, the Capitol backdrop in the studio, the crematorium on the bottom level, was a rational answer to a real question the planners had been forced to ask. The building is a physical record of a government sitting down and seriously imagining its own worst day, and then engineering a response to every part of it. And all of it was kept stocked, maintained, and ready for 30 years by about a dozen people hiding behind a fake television repair company, while the guests upstairs never suspected a thing. The remarkable part is that today, you no longer have to take anyone's word for any of this, because the deception itself has become a door you can walk through. This is the rare story of this kind where you do not need to file a records request, interpret a radar image, or climb a fence. Unlike almost any other Cold War secret, this one is now a legitimate, ticketed public attraction. You can simply buy a ticket. The Greenbrier still runs official tours of the bunker. They opened to resort guests in 1995 and to the general public in 2006. The tour lasts about 90 minutes and walks you through the real spaces, the decontamination area, the dormitories, the House and Senate chambers, the cafeteria, the power plant, and the great blast doors themselves. There is one honest limitation worth knowing, and it actually tells you something. No cameras or phones are allowed inside the bunker on the tour. That is precisely why legitimate interior footage of this place is limited and worth treating as valuable, and why the resort's own official images and properly licensed documentary footage are the sources that matter here. If you see a flood of casual phone footage from inside, something is off. For the documentary record, the primary source is free to read. The origin of everything the public knows is the article the Washington Post reporter Ted Gupp published in 1992, and reading the reporter's own account carries more weight than any second-hand summary of it. It is worth noting, for accuracy, that the Washington Times actually ran a story 2 days earlier, on the 29th of May, but it was Gupp's fuller piece that truly broke the thing open. And after the facility was declassified, the National Archives released architectural plans and construction records, which is why the specifications in this video can be stated with such precision. These are not estimates, they are on paper. So here is the useful reframe, and it is the thing to actually do if you ever find yourself in that corner of West Virginia. Go and stand in the exhibition hall of the West Virginia Wing. It looks like an ordinary convention space, and for decades that is all that anyone saw. Then look for the details. The concrete columns that are far too heavy for a room like this. The section of wall that once held a decorative screen, and behind it, the blast door. You would be standing in the single best preserved example in America of a lie you can physically touch. The West Virginia Wing is not a story you have to trust. It is a room you can visit. And that points directly at the mistake almost everyone makes with this story. People hear secret bunker for Congress and immediately ask whether it would have worked. Could Congress really have survived down there? But that question, interesting as it is, misses a stranger and quieter one that almost nobody asked at the time. Who exactly was invited through that blast door, and who was not? Here is the detail that even people who know this story tend to skip past. The plan was for the members of Congress. Only the members of Congress, plus the essential staff needed to run the place, not their husbands and wives, not their children. The bunker had berthing for around 1,100 people, and the arithmetic behind that number was cold. It was built to hold the roughly 535 legislators and the personnel required to keep the facility running, and nothing more. A senator arriving at that 25-ton door in a real emergency would, under the actual plan, have had to leave their family standing on the other side of it. The resort's longtime historian, Bob Conti, and Gupp himself both pointed to the real anxiety humming underneath this entire project. It was not fear that the plan would leak to the Soviets. It was fear of what the American public would think. That people would realize Congress had quietly built a shelter to save itself, at a luxury resort no less, while ordinary families had nothing but a basement and a prayer. That is the real reason it had to stay secret. Not the engineering. The optics of survival. And then there is the logistical fantasy at the center of it, which deserves to be said plainly. For the plan to work, all 535 members of Congress would have had to travel 250 miles from Washington out to rural West Virginia, in the window of warning before a nuclear strike landed. In the 1950s, when the threat was bombers that took hours to cross the polar ice, that was almost believable. But by the age of the intercontinental ballistic missile, the warning time had collapsed from hours to minutes. And Gupp's single strongest defense for publishing rested on exactly that point. The bunker was already obsolete. It had been designed for a delivery time that no longer existed. But sit for a moment with the secret keeping itself, because that is the genuine marvel here. Those dozen or so technicians from the fake company, Forsyth Associates, maintained a fully stocked, ready-to-occupy bunker for 30 years. They rotated the supplies, they tested the systems, they kept the pharmacy current, all of it under the cover of repairing hotel televisions. And then there is the town. White Sulphur Springs is small, and many of its families had worked at the Greenbrier for generations. A striking number of local people suspected, or half knew, or had pieced together enough, and they simply said nothing for 3 decades. When the story finally broke in 1992, Conte noted that very few locals were actually surprised. So circle back to the thing supposedly hidden under the luxury hotel. It was never really the concrete, or the blast doors, or even the crematorium on the bottom level. What was hidden was a decision. A decision about who the government would save and who it would leave outside, made quietly, cast in steel, and buried under an exhibition hall precisely so that no one would ever have to stand up and defend it out loud. The bunker kept that decision secret far more effectively than it could ever have kept out an actual bomb. As for what happened to it, the ending is almost gentle. Once Gup's story ran, the facility was decommissioned almost immediately because secrecy had always been its true defense, and the secrecy was gone. In 1995, the government formally handed the space over to the resort. Today, part of it is the tourist attraction you can visit, and part of it is leased out as climate-controlled data storage, which means a shelter built to preserve the continuity of the American government now preserves corporate backup files. And there remains a quiet, unconfirmed assumption, one that Gup and others have pointedly declined to discuss, that somewhere else, a replacement was eventually built. Where Congress would actually go today, nobody who knows is willing to say. The Greenbrier bunker did not really fail when a reporter exposed it in 1992. It had quietly failed decades earlier, the moment the missiles became fast enough that the 250-mile drive to safety turned into a drive nobody would ever have the time to take. So come back to that guest at the start, the one who saw only a luxury hotel. They were not being naive. They were seeing precisely what 30 years of deliberate design intended them to see. The genius of this place was never the concrete or the blast doors. It was the decision to hide a doomsday shelter, not behind a mountain or a fence, but behind hospitality itself. Behind golf and chandeliers and a convention hall. Because nobody goes looking for the end of the world at a 5-star resort. The disguise worked so completely that its own designers eventually admitted the disguise had been the entire defense all along. They called it the West Virginia Wing, and for 30 years, that plain, forgettable name did exactly what it was built to do. It was never a wing with a secret buried underneath it. The wing was the secret. The exhibition hall was the roof of the shelter. The columns were its bones, and the guests holding their conventions were standing inside the very thing they were unknowingly helping to hide, on the safe side of a blast door for the time being. You can still go. The tour runs today about 90 minutes, and they will walk you down to the decontamination showers, and the stripped and empty dormitories, and the meeting room where the House of Representatives would have gathered. Leave your phone in the car, because they will not let you carry it in. And when you are standing in that bright exhibition hall at the very start, before you reach the blast door, do just one thing. Look up at the ceiling, and remember that it was engineered to hold the weight of the world above it, while the government of the United States waited underneath for the all clear. Then decide for yourself, which is the stranger fact? That a place like this existed at all, or that for 30 years you could have danced on top of it and never once known it was there.